Just before 7:30 in the morning, an officer's radio crackles with an address in a quiet street in Derbyshire. A relative has called a police force 200 miles away, worried about a man who might have hurt himself. Officers arrive to find that man standing outside the house, a wound to his own body, seemingly the only injury anyone needs to worry about. He looks at them and says he needs an ambulance. Then he tells them why. Inside that house are 4 people, a mother, her 2 children, and her daughter's best friend, who had only come round for a sleepover the night before. None of them will be getting up that morning. This is the case of Terri Harris, her children John Paul and Lacey Bennett, Lacey's friend Connie Gent, and the man who was living under their roof. Now, if this is your first time here, I'm really glad you found this channel. Every day I dive deep into real criminal cases, breaking them down piece by piece so we can actually understand what happened and why. If that sounds like something you'd be into, go ahead and hit subscribe. It's free, and it means a lot. Okay, now let's get back to the case. Terri Harris was 35 years old, and by September of 2021, she was pregnant. She was a mother first and foremost, raising her 2 children, John Paul and Lacey Bennett, in their home on Chandos Crescent in Killamarsh, a small town in Derbyshire not far from Sheffield. John Paul was 13, Lacey was 11. Like so many children their age, their world was built around school, friendships, and the small, ordinary routines of family life. On the night of the 18th of September, that ordinary life included something entirely unremarkable: a sleepover. Lacey's close friend, 11-year-old Connie Gent, came to stay the night. The kind of plan countless families make every single weekend, with no reason to think twice about it. By the next morning, that sleepover and the family hosting it would be gone entirely. It is worth pausing on the shape of this household before anything else. A mother expecting another child. 2 children growing up in what looked, from the outside, like a normal home, and a young girl who had simply come round to spend time with her best friend, trusting, as any child would, that she was safe there. None of these 4 people had any reason to believe that the final hours of their lives had already begun. There was no single afternoon anyone can point to and say, "This is where everything changed." Connie Gent's parents would have said goodbye to her that Saturday evening, with no more concern than any parent feels dropping a child off for a night with a close friend. Terri, meanwhile, was building toward the future, rather than looking back at any difficulty. A new baby on the way, 2 children already growing up in the home she had made. There was simply a Saturday night sleepover, a family getting ready for bed, and a morning that never should have arrived the way it did. News of what had happened in Killamarsh spread quickly through the surrounding area, and then far beyond it. This was, and remains, a small, close-knit town, the kind of place where a family's loss becomes the entire community's loss almost immediately. Tributes left outside the house in the days that followed filled the small front garden and spilled onto the pavement. Flowers and messages left by people who had never met Terri or her children, but who understood, in the way any parent does, exactly what had been taken from that family. Damien Bendall was 31 years old in September of 2021. He was Terri Harris's partner, and by that point he was living with her and her children at the house on Chandos Crescent. Before this relationship, he had spent time as a cage fighter, an interest that, on its own, would have alarmed no one, and only in hindsight, alongside everything else documented about him, reads as one more piece of a public persona that gave almost no indication of what lay underneath it. That history was significant, and it was known to the authorities well before he ever moved in with Terri and her children. Bendall had a record of serious and violent offences stretching back to 2004. At the time of the killings, he was serving a suspended sentence of 17 months for arson, committed in Swindon in May of 2020, and he was living under an electronic monitoring tag as a condition of that sentence. One probation officer who had dealt with him directly would later describe him, in evidence heard after his conviction, in blunt and unambiguous terms, as cold, calculated, and quite psychopathic. This was not a retrospective judgment made only after the fact. It was an assessment formed by someone who had sat across from him and reached that conclusion while he was still, technically, considered manageable within the community. Despite that history, Bendall had been assessed as posing what the system classified as a low risk of serious harm to partners and children. He was living in the same house as a pregnant woman, her 2 children, and, on the night that mattered most, an 11-year-old guest who had no idea any of this history existed. That risk classification is worth pausing on because it sits at the very center of everything that follows in this case. A low-risk assessment is not a casual guess. It is meant to be the product of a formal, structured process, drawing on an offender's documented history and any behavior that might signal escalating danger. For a man with violent offenses dating back 17 years, currently serving a sentence for arson, and living inside a household with 3 children, that classification would later be examined and questioned in the most serious possible setting, a coroner's court, following the deaths of everyone he was living with. What later investigations revealed made that classification even harder to understand. A fault within the probation system's own records meant that critical information about Bendall's history had simply gone missing from the file used to assess him. There was no record that a previous partner had accused him of domestic violence. There was no record that police had, at an earlier point, formally marked him as a sexual risk to young girls. A risk assessment can only ever be as reliable as the information it is built on, and in Bendall's case, some of the most serious information available anywhere in his history never made it into the file at all. There is one detail in this case that deserves to stand entirely on its own, separate from everything else, because of how directly it foreshadows what eventually happened. At some point before September of 2021, a contractor from the electronic monitoring service visited Bendall to fit the very tag he was required to wear under his suspended sentence. During that visit, according to evidence given after his conviction, Bendall told her plainly, "If this relationship goes bad, I will murder my girlfriend and the children." That contractor did not pass the comment on to the probation service. It is difficult to overstate how significant this single, missed moment became once the full picture of this case was examined. This was not a vague, generalized threat of violence in the abstract. It was a specific statement, naming the exact people he would go on to kill, made directly to someone employed to monitor him for risk. Instead of being recorded and escalated, it existed only in that contractor's memory, unshared with anyone responsible for assessing whether Bendall posed a danger to the household he was living in. Terri Harris never had the chance to weigh that information against her own judgment, because it never reached her, or anyone positioned to intervene on her behalf. Separately, the probation service in Swindon, which had been managing Bendall's case before he moved in with Terri, was later found to have handled his supervision to what the Chief Inspector of Probation described as an unacceptable standard at every single stage, with critical opportunities to correct course missed along the way. A senior officer holding roughly 350 active files at the time had passed responsibility for supervising Bendall onto a far less experienced colleague, one who went on to permit him to serve his curfew at Terri Harris's own home, living alongside her 3 children, on the strength of that same low-risk classification. Cases involving prior warnings that go unreported are unfortunately not unique to this one incident. Researchers who study risk management failures in offender supervision describe a recurring pattern individual staff members hearing something concerning, often in passing, during a routine interaction, without a clear, enforced system in place to ensure that information is escalated. A single missed report rarely causes a tragedy on its own. It becomes catastrophic only when it combines with everything else already documented about a person's history, exactly the combination that existed, unexamined as a whole, in Damien Bendall's case. In the early hours of the 19th of September 2021, inside the house on Chandos Crescent, Damien Bendall killed all 4 people inside it: Terri Harris, her son John Paul, her daughter Lacey, and Lacey's friend Connie, using a claw hammer, attacking each of them in different rooms of the home. As part of the same attack, he also raped 11-year-old Lacey Bennett, an act to which he later formally pleaded guilty alongside the 4 murders. Police later said Bendall had been under the influence of cocaine and cannabis during the attack. He himself told officers he had consumed 3 to 4 bags of cocaine before, in his words, blacking out. Investigators who examined the scene described the level of force used as showing a single, unmistakable intention to take the lives of everyone inside that house. By morning, all 4 victims were dead. The home that had, only hours earlier, hosted an ordinary children's sleepover had become the scene of one of the most severe domestic mass killings in recent English history. There is little more that needs to be said about the details of that night, beyond what has already been stated. The scale of what happened inside that house speaks for itself, and does not require further description to be understood as one of the most devastating single acts of violence any English community has experienced in recent memory. What matters most in the account that follows is not the mechanics of the attack itself, but how it came to light and what it revealed once investigators began to look closely at everything that had led up to it. At 26 minutes past 7 that morning, Dorset police received a call from a relative of Bendall's, expressing concern for his safety and saying he had suffered a self-inflicted stab wound. Dorset police alerted Derbyshire police, and officers were dispatched to Chandos Crescent. Arriving at 39 minutes past 7, they found Bendall outside the house. He told them plainly, "I need the police and an ambulance because I just killed 4 people." Officers entered the property, concerned for the safety of anyone else who might be inside, and located the bodies of Terri Harris, John Paul Bennett, Lacey Bennett, and Connie Gent. Paramedics arrived shortly after and confirmed what officers already knew. Police body-worn footage from that morning captured Bendall repeating, in almost the same breath, that he had murdered 4 people. In comments later reported from that same encounter, he was recorded making a remark about the killings that included a reference to Terri's pregnancy, treating the loss of her unborn child as though it was simply an additional detail to mention. Separate CCTV footage, recovered as part of the investigation, showed him calmly buying cigarettes in the aftermath of what he had just done. The contrast between the horror of what had happened inside that house and the almost businesslike manner in which Bendall described and moved through the hours immediately afterwards would go on to define much of the public shock this case generated. For the officers who arrived at the scene that morning, the experience of walking into that house has never been described publicly in detail, and there is little reason it should be. What can be said is that Derbyshire police, an ordinary regional force not accustomed to events of this scale, found themselves managing one of the most severe crime scenes any of them would encounter in their careers, all before most of the surrounding community had even woken up for the day. In the days that followed, specialist family liaison officers were assigned to support the surviving relatives of all 4 victims, a formal role within English policing designed specifically to help families navigate an investigation of this scale while grieving losses this severe. Detectives, meanwhile, began the parallel task of reconstructing not just the hours before the killings, but the years of documented history that had led up to them, a process that would ultimately extend well beyond Bendall's conviction and into the inquests that followed. Damien Bendall was charged with 4 counts of murder, along with the rape of Lacey Bennett. He appeared at Derby Crown Court, where he was remanded into custody. Initially, Bendall admitted manslaughter, but denied murder, a legal position that would have required the court to accept some lesser degree of intent behind what he had done. That position did not hold. He ultimately pleaded guilty to all 4 murders and to the rape of Lacey Bennett. On the 21st of December 2022, at the age of 32, Damien Bendall was sentenced to a whole life order, meaning he will never be considered for release under any circumstances. Detective Inspector Mark Shaw, speaking after the case concluded, said the level of force and violence used in the attacks showed they were carried out with one clear intention: to take the lives of Terri, John Paul, Lacey, and Connie. For the families left behind, a life sentence, even one that guarantees Bendall will die in prison, answered only the legal question of accountability. It did nothing to answer the far harder question of how a man with his documented history had been living, unsupervised in any meaningful sense, inside a family home. A whole life order is one of the rarest sentences available under English law, reserved specifically for cases considered so severe that the possibility of eventual release is removed entirely. Its use here reflected the scale of what had happened: 4 lives taken in a single attack, including 2 children and a young guest in their home, alongside the additional and separate offence against Lacey Bennett. For Bendall himself, the sentence closed the legal chapter of this case. For the wider public, and for the families of everyone he killed, it opened a much longer chapter, centered on understanding exactly how this had been allowed to happen at all. The guilty plea itself, arriving after an initial attempt to admit only manslaughter, meant that Terri, John Paul, Lacey, and Connie's families were spared the additional ordeal of a lengthy contested trial. That is not a small mercy in cases of this scale, where a full trial can require surviving relatives to sit through detailed accounts of exactly how their loved ones died, spread across weeks of proceedings. Even so, sentencing day itself required the court, and everyone present in it, to hear the full scope of what Bendall had done, formally read into the record, one final time. The court also formally recorded his guilty plea to the rape of Lacey Bennett as a distinct and separate offence from the 4 murders, ensuring that this part of what happened to her was addressed directly by the court, rather than folded silently into the broader murder charge relating to her death. For her family, that distinction mattered, a formal, public acknowledgement of everything that had been done to her, not only that her life had been taken. Following Bendall's conviction, an independent, serious further offence review examined how his supervision had been managed, and in October of 2023, a formal coroner's inquest into the deaths of all 4 victims opened at Chesterfield Coroner's Court. Their purpose was not to determine who was responsible, that question had already been settled, but to examine, in far greater detail than the criminal trial ever required, how the systems meant to manage a known violent offender had failed so completely. It was during these hearings that the full picture already described, the missing records, the unreported threat, the strained Swindon caseload, the curfew permitted at Terri's own home, was formally placed on the public record, drawn out through direct testimony from the officers involved. The senior coroner concluded that all 4 victims had been unlawfully killed, and went further still, identifying 57 separate systemic omissions and failures, spanning both the probation service and the electronic monitoring service, that had directly contributed to their deaths. 57 is not a figure that describes a single oversight. It describes a system that failed, in some documented way, at nearly every point where it might have intervened. None of this reduces Bendall's own responsibility for what he chose to do, but it does raise a far broader and more uncomfortable question: one that extends well beyond this single case. How many other individuals, currently being supervised under similarly overwhelmed systems, are being assessed today using the same processes that so badly failed to protect Terri Harris and her family? It is worth being clear about what an inquest can and cannot achieve at this stage. It cannot undo what happened on the 19th of September. It cannot restore any of the 4 lives lost that night. What it can do, and what these particular hearings were specifically designed to do, is force a public, detailed reckoning with exactly where a system broke down, in the hope that the same gaps do not go unnoticed the next time a similarly high-risk individual passes through it. It is worth ending, as always, with who these 4 people actually were, rather than only how their lives ended. Terri Harris was a mother expecting another child, building a home for the family she already had. John Paul and Lacey Bennett were 13 and 11, children with their own friendships, their own small daily routines, their own futures ahead of them. And Connie Gent was 11 years old, a little girl who had simply gone to a friend's house for the night, trusting, as every child should be able to, that she would wake up safe. Their home on Chandos Crescent was demolished in July of 2023. At the request of their family, the land afterwards landscaped and turfed as a quiet tribute to the 4 people who died there. In September of 2025, the law firm Taylor Rose secured legal compensation from the authorities on behalf of the surviving parents and grandparents of Terri, John Paul and Lacey, a formal acknowledgement, separate from the criminal courts, that the systems meant to protect this family had failed them. The case has since become one of the most widely cited examples of institutional failure in recent British history, prompting the Ministry of Justice to introduce a series of reforms intended to tighten how high-risk offenders are tracked and assessed going forward. There is one further development worth noting, not because it changes anything about the case itself, but because it speaks to the man at the center of it. In early 2026, more than 4 years after the killings, Bendall was handed an additional life sentence for a separate attack carried out inside prison, striking a fellow inmate repeatedly in the head with a claw hammer, the same type of weapon he had used at Chandos Crescent. It is, in its own bleak way, a final confirmation of the assessment one probation officer had given years earlier, describing him as cold, calculated, and quite psychopathic, a description that, however clinically stated, has been borne out by everything that has followed since. For Terri Harris, John Paul, Lacey, and Connie, none of this changes anything. What their families are left with is not a system that has been fixed, but a detailed, uncomfortable record, gathered across an independent review and a coroner's inquest, of exactly how a known risk was allowed to move through a system built to catch it, unremarked upon, until it reached a family with no way of knowing what they were living alongside. Whether that record leads to meaningful change for the next family in a similar position is no longer a question this case alone can answer. It belongs now to everyone responsible for the systems it exposed. If you want to understand how systems meant to protect families can fail this completely, and what has changed, or has not changed, in the years since, that is exactly what this channel is for. Every day, we break these cases down properly, without the noise, so hit subscribe if that is something you want more of. Thank you for watching.